Hello, it's me, Editing Jess. Turns out that microphone on my shirt isn't actually working, so I will be narrating this entire intro via voiceover. Oversized sweaters are the best. Cozy and comfy, like a big hug. But there's oversized and there's sloppy big. And the difference usually comes down to the sleeve. By the way, I've also bookmarked this whole video, so if you want to skip around to different points, it should be easy to do so. This is my husband's old sweater that I've been wearing for a while now, and yeah, sloppy big. There are many ways to go about this. I could cut the sleeve and serge the inside, but that would create a seam right here. Instead, I'm going to show you how to keep the original rib start of the sleeve and reattach it in a clean, seamless way. Folks, this isn't a quick and easy 5-minute fix. It's going to take a bit of time, so grab your blunt tapestry needle, snips, some extra yarn, and snuggle up and settle in. But first, a quick and dirty explanation of knit. Unlike woven material which has been cut and sewn into a garment, the panels of fully fashioned knits are made of one very long length of yarn that has been looped together in rows. If you cut a woven fabric, it will fray, which is bad enough, but if you cut a knit, it will unravel, which can be a lot worse. Because of its looped structure, knit also stretches, so any straight stitches run the risk of snapping and breaking when the fabric inevitably stretches. So as we proceed, just keep those things in mind. Knit unravels and it stretches. But first things first, of course, I need to figure out how much of the sleeve length to remove. Luckily for us, at this point I switched over to voiceover anyway, so I guess we'll just stay with this. We're going to keep the original rib start, so we'll be removing a chunk just past the rib. I'm pinching out the amount to be removed, starting with the row after the rib. No need to overcomplicate this by trying to stitch the rib into the jersey. And count the number of rows of knit to be removed so that I can match it perfectly on both sleeves. To do this accurately, I count along a single column of stitches. I find it easiest to slip my tapestry needle into the first stitch and sort of run it along the column, counting each hole the needle slips into. I do want these to still be oversized, just not so sloppy. So in the end, I'm removing 53 rows of knitting from each sleeve. You should also count the number of stitches in the rows you're connecting. Often the sleeves get wider at the top, and while the difference probably won't be too dramatic this low on the sleeve, you may need to knit a couple of stitches together a few times, and you'll want to do that evenly. For example, the row where my alteration starts has 72 stitches, and where it ends has 94 stitches, a difference of 22 stitches. 72 divided by 22 is 3.41, so every 3 stitches I'll be sewing 2 of the top row of stitches, or we'll just call it the sleeve end of the alteration, into 1 of the starting row stitches. We'll call this the rib end of the alteration, with a few 1-to-1 stitches at the end. The panel is knit from the rib up, and a rib won't unravel upwards, but this is jersey or stockinette stitch if you're a hand knitter, and it will unravel in both directions. To begin the alteration, I cut through the middle of the chunk to be removed. I unraveled the yarn upwards to the top of the alterations. The first row is tricky because it has all the cut fuzzies in the loops. Just pop them out. You could unlink the side seam and continuously unravel the panel. I find it simpler to just cut the yarn at the seam and keep the seam intact. I do the same for the bottom of the alteration. I stop unraveling at my pin. See all the little loops ready to be stitched into place? I could definitely use this last piece of attached self yarn to sew these together, which I'll show on the second sleeve, but for the first sleeve I'll use a contrasting yarn so you all can see the stitches. I thread my needle and knot a slip knot at the end of the yarn to anchor it. I start by anchoring the stitches and making sure they're aligned before getting into the true repeat. I pull the yarn through the first open loop at the side seam of the sleeve side of the alteration back to front. I then pull the yarn through the first open loop on the rib side of the alteration front to back. Here is where the true repeat begins. I pull the yarn back through the very first loop I went through on the sleeve side front to back, and through the next loop on the sleeve side back to front. I pull the yarn through the previous loop I went through on the rib side front to back, and through the next loop on the rib side back to front, through the previous loop on the sleeve side front to back, and through the next loop back to front, Always go front to back, back to front, and when going from one side of the alteration to the other, always go through the previous loop. As per my calculations earlier, after 3 of these repeats, I need to stitch 2 loops on the sleeve side together. I do this by looping through the last loop front to back as usual, then grabbing the following loop back to front, then grabbing the next loop back to front on the same row. This knits those 2 stitches together. I stitch the rib side as usual. It's important to keep all of these stitches tensioned so that they remain uniform, but don't pull too tightly or you could pull loops down the line out of place. You can see we're making little V's that match the jersey stitch. We're essentially re-knitting this row of stitches. When I get to the end, I loop the yarn back through the side seam a couple of times to make sure everything is secure. I undo that initial slip knot back at the beginning of the work, and I use the beginning and end tails to make a knot. And here you have it. And on the back we have little pearls. I had planned to re-knit this with the self yarn to make it invisible, but I actually like the visible alteration. It's kind of a cool little detail. Now let's do the invisible version on the other sleeve. I press the self yarn with an iron to get out all the indentations. This yarn is helpfully still anchored to the sleeve side, so I brought it down through the first loop of the rib side front to back, through the next loop back to front, and back across the next loop of the sleeve side front to back, through the next loop back to front, and so on. It's a little scary working with loose stitches like this, knowing that technically the unstitched loops could pull loose at any point, but from my experiences, the stitches are pretty well set in there. You all saw what the yarn looked like when we unraveled. The stitches want to be in position. It takes a little effort to unravel them. Ah, invisible. There's ever so much gathering since we're occasionally knitting 2 stitches together, but otherwise looks like the original connection. I again looped off the side. Even though the row of stitches is even and straight, the side seam linking is usually a bit off-kilter. So I just closed up the resulting hole, and here we have it. Once you master this alteration, you can actually find quite a few uses for it. You can lower a neckline or even crop the actual hem of the sweater this way. It can be a bit tedious, but I don't know, I love this kind of stitch-to-stitch sewing. It's soothing somehow. If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up. And hit subscribe if you enjoy making the most out of every scrap of clothing in your wardrobe. I've got a few more of these alteration videos planned over the next few months, but mostly I'll be using this space to develop a collection. I've got a design vlog coming up for that endeavor in just a couple of weeks. Until next time, bye!